Hello friends, we are in the middle of the series that we started some time back, and it is focused upon modern poetry in England and Europe, and particularly of the 20th century. And we pick up generally a poetic piece, a poem, and the author and the context in the process, and then we discuss the specific poem that we have taken up. Now, for that reason, today we have with us Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janki Devi Memorial College, and she teaches English, but she is well conversant with literary theory and in fact literatures that are other than English, like Indian literatures. And today the poet that she has picked up and the poem specifically that she'll take up from there is Louis MacNeice. I might have heard this poet. He was a very important voice of poetry in England in the 1930s, and as all of us know, 1930s is a very crucial period in our history in India and in the history of England and Europe and the world, because 1930s is placed very comfortably between 1910s and 20s on the one side and 1940s on the other, and that this is the pre-war, or in fact this is the interwar period that Louis MacNeice dealt with in his poetry and in his life. So without more on this aspect that we have with us at the moment, I request Professor Payal Nagpal to just tell us about Louis MacNeice, his predicament, his opinions, and his leanings, all those things, because they are all reflected, I'm sure, in the poems and poetry that Professor Payal Nagpal will take up. So over to you, Professor Payal Nagpal.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Today we'll be discussing a very important poem by Louis MacNeice. It's a very long poem. It's titled The Autumn Journal. So we will be looking at Louis MacNeice's views on poetry. They're very important for us to understand the kind of poet that he was and the kind of contribution that MacNeice made to the field of poetry and to the field of literature. So he was just a little biographical information. So he was born in 1907 and lived up to 1963, and he was an Irish poet, playwright, producer. As Professor Prakash just mentioned, that he was part of what was called the Poet of the 30s, or the Auden group, along with C.D. Lewis, Stephen Spender, and Christopher Isherwood. He met Auden at Oxford. He also was, in touch with T.S. Eliot, and he sent his poems to T.S. Eliot, who published it in the Criterion. And Louis MacNeice figured in two very important collections. One was titled The Faber Book of Modern Verse, and the second is titled The Oxford Book of Modern Verse. He published plays also, and at least one play from his time is generally accepted to, having been unstaged as Black Legs. But it's interesting to note that his translation of Agamemnon is something that the group theatre had, put up, and accepted another play which was written, keeping the group theatre in mind. And this was produced and published in 1937, titled Out of the Picture. Now, one of the things that's very commonly said of Louis MacNeice is that initially he was a bit of an aesthete. The entire movement of art for art's sake greatly influenced him. However, gradually, in the 1930s, when he arrived at Birmingham, we are looking at these as, centers that were cities that were very developed in terms of industries, and there were, huge industrial centers. But at the same time, so if one end of the spectrum for him was aesthetics, and he kind of appreciated it, the other end was that of realism. And he felt that, both in a sense had gone off in two very different directions. So if we were to look at MacNeice's work, it tries to evolved that kind of median pitch where aesthetics and realism are both at work in a very moderate manner. So, not explicitly so, and it just kind of flows. And Autumn Journal would be a very good example of this. So he greatly appreciated the work of W.B. Yeats, and he saw Yeats's work to be a kind of bridge between these two also. Walter Allen said something very interesting about Louis MacNeice that defines it for us. He said that he came, and I'm quoting Allen here, he came an aesthete but discovered in Birmingham common humanity and realized it in himself. So there are three aspects to it: his initial preoccupation with aesthetics, and how coming to a place like Birmingham, he realized the plight of the common people, and he realized and looked at the world, the society, for what it really was. So, this idea of common humanity is there. And thirdly, how he realizes it in himself, in his way of looking at things and of capturing it in poetry. So, with this, we actually look at a very important work by him, which is titled The Autumn Journal, and the dates are very interesting. So, one of the reasons that we've selected this for this particular lecture, it was first, of course, published by Faber and Faber. He wrote this poem, he wrote this journal, I should say, in 1938 and published it in 1939. It is a 24-part semi-autobiographical poem where each section is approximately 80 lines. And we can see with the dates that he's writing a journal about his day-to-day activities, capturing it in poetry, his thoughts, observations, some trivia that he might have experienced and he wanted to record it. But all this is happening just around the time that the Second World War is about to begin. So, we must note that this is a journal that is written in poetic form. So, this aspect of observation, this aspect of recording events, but recording events in poetry. So, for example, Teresa Bruce says about the Autumn Journal that it is and I quote, that it is an inclusive personal archive of echoes of public events. So, where the individual, the poet here, becomes a repository, his or her reading becomes a repository of events that have taken place around him or her. And so, in a sense, the poet is somebody who is a witness to the times, and this person writes in the garb of a very ordinary person, does not claim to be somebody absolutely extraordinary, but writes in the garb of an ordinary person. So, we must focus on the word journal. And it's all in poetry. Is more or less use the quatrain form. So it's a journal, but it is within poetry. So I'll request Professor Prakash to please share his views on journaling and doing it in the poetic form. We had one session on Anais Nin, and there too we discussed how she's known to be a diarist, and how a lot of things that she's written in her diary are extremely poetic. And here we have a poet who's using the form of the journal. Today we talk about life narratives and confessional writing and so on. But in Louis MacNeice's work, I think it's one of the early examples, in a sense, of this kind of writing.
Yes, in the 1930s, it was an issue because at the back of the 1930s were the First World War,
Yes.
and the 19th century. And writers, you have also brought in the concept of realism. So realism was supposed to be something that happened in society, and that the individual poet would always keep to oneself, the opinions and the perceptions, but he would talk in the broadly classical sense. Aesthetes, the other thing that you have mentioned, they in fact kept away from social issues generally, because for them, poetry had to be poetry. It had to be poetic in nature, and it could not, cross those boundaries to compromise with the circumstance. So that was the issue, and Very rightly you say that something happened in the 19th century, and Louis MacNeice learned his lessons the hard way, starting as an aesthete and then coming over to society. And this Birmingham example is really very interesting, that the person comes to Birmingham, and it must be a working class town, and that town leaves its imprint on him, and he starts writing what is called social or realistic poetry. Now, the question that you raised regarding, the diary poem or the poem that is called a journal, where one confesses one's own acts, and then gives an opinion, but they are of a general nature, and that's a new form at that time. Today, everybody talks about oneself only.
Yes.
But this trend, I think, starts with the 1930s, and English poetry must have started with Louis MacNeice.
Yes, yes. It is true that, I'm also not really aware of anybody else who has recorded, and there's a specific period to it, He starts writing around August 1938, and he writes till December. So it's a journal that belongs to...
Second World War is breathing down his neck.
It's breathing down his neck. It's very, very almost prophetic in a certain sense.
Yes.
And he's, it has a time period. So it fulfills, the requirements in a sense of, a journal, that it belongs, really speaking, to a specific time period. It's not general in that sense.
No, actually, as a poet, I think he is able to anticipate that things are going to be difficult in the coming years. And therefore, he goes into his own shell and looks at, the world from his individual angle. And in fact, this becomes very authentic at that point of time, because if you wrote slogan then for or against something, then that would not only compromise on aestheticism, but also on one's individual honesty.
So he writes, his views on poetry are very interesting, and I just share these. So in this book, when it was published, that is the Autumn Journal, he wrote a note to the poem in that particular book. And I'll just share this quote with you viewers. He writes, if I had been writing a didactic poem proper, it would have been my job to qualify or eliminate overstatements. He begins by saying that there are some overstatements and inconsistencies. But he says if he had been writing a didactic poem, then he should have had eliminated these overstatements. But he says, and I quote, but I was writing what I have called a journal. In a journal or a personal letter, a man writes what he feels at the moment. To attempt scientific truthfulness would be paradoxically dishonest. The truth of a lyric is different from the truth of science, and this poem is something halfway between the lyric and the didactic poem. So, he completely not only expresses his views, and he's talking about another kind of truth, another kind of honesty, which is not scientific, it's not empirical in form, but it is mediated. This honesty and this truth is mediated through the individual, through the I. First and foremost, the poet should not be dishonest to himself. So he's, giving up on any kind of contradictory scientific truthfulness that might be there, but he feels that his understanding and his observation needs to be documented. It might appear inconsistent, but because it's a journal, it is his understanding of a particular moment, and that is what needs to be kept in mind. So he also talks about who a poet should be, and says something very interesting here. He says, and I quote, I would have a poet able-bodied, fond of talking, a reader of the newspapers, capable of pity and laughter, informed in economics, appreciative of women, involved in personal relationships, actively interested in politics, susceptible to physical impressions. So, this for him, this is in the Book of Modern Verse, he writes this, and he says that this is what a poet should be, and he himself probably fulfills all this when we read some excerpts from the Autumn Journal.
Let me bring in the personal note. You are a poet yourself.
Yeah.
So suppose you have to say that this is what a poet is and this is what poetry is. What would you say from your own on behalf?
So I think this idea of, when he says newspapers, a reader of newspapers,
Economics.
economics, and to be appreciative, I would read that as respectful towards women. So I think he's, in a single statement, I think what Louis MacNeice is saying is somebody who is organically connected to society and somebody who is able to see things around him
Who doesn't
with
follow
honesty.
any command,
Who
who
does not follow.
writes what one feels.
Writes what one feels.
Absolutely.
And-
And this person has to be composite. He or she has to be social, has
Yes.
to be well informed in the circumstances of society, opinions, but it should be his own honest, authentic opinion.
Absolutely. So this is a very valuable point, I think, and this is, with no indication of, and his giving up, his rejection actually of the scientific truth is rejection of, I think, a kind of truth that the society converts into a norm. So he says that is not to be accepted.
And goes completely against the pedagogical or didactic
Yes.
thing.
Yes. So he's not playing to the gallery and is telling us that poetry has to be something where the poet is able to observe things around him in a sensitive manner, because susceptible to physical impressions and involved in personal relationships and actively interested in politics. So I think this organic connection between the poet and the society is what Louis MacNeice establishes, and I think for this reason Louis MacNeice is a very important poet of the 1930s. So when we, really speaking, look at his views, we say he also goes on to say that, that the book, it is said of this particular book that it is a plea for impure poetry, that is poetry that is conditioned by the poet's life and the work around him. So he's in a sense given us, a kind of new frame in the 20th century within which we can place the poet and also change what we expect from a poet, really speaking. So this, and also there is no sense of the isolation as far as the poet is concerned. The poet is somebody who's very involved in society. So he says, I was writing it from August 1938 until the New Year Eve. And he says he's not altered any passages that relate to public events and so on. And he says that what he's writing in the Autumn Journal is about everyday life during that period. And this is everyday life pretty much at the beginning of the Second World War. So memory and journaling is very important. A very interesting anecdote to Autumn Journal that I'd like to share here is how T.S. Eliot really appreciated this poem. So when T.S. Eliot, once he read the poem, he specially wrote to Louis MacNeice that there was a lot of strength in the poem. And he said, I have read through the Autumn Journal and think it is very good indeed. He says that he was moved by the poem. And he says that even though it was a very long poem, he found that his interest did not flag at any point. To quote T.S. Eliot, he says, I found that I read it through without my interest flagging at any point. And he says there are two reasons for it. One, the kind of dexterity with which the poem is written, the versification. And the second aspect is the imagery. So it's these two things that he, really speaking, talks about.
In his poetry, being very close to the event that is going to happen, is going to start in the 1939, and therefore, he's capturing each moment very specifically. And that moment may be his personal moment, moment of personal truths that a poet always has, and he has the option of including that in one's poetic expression. All that is very important. But I think the major point that you are making in this particular statement is that the writer is capturing his time, the moment of which he is a part, and that later on becomes historical. It is historical for us today.
Yes.
When we read about the mood of the poet at that time, just before the Second World War begins, That is what we want to know. And the feel is there in his poetry, the feel we can't get today because we are so much distanced in time from the 20th century World War, Second World War particularly. So I think it's very valuable that poets write about their personal images at then and share them with the audience.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's how it should be. And I think we are nearing the end of the first session of the discussion. And in this session, Professor Payal Nagpal has talked about Louis MacNeice in general, and she has in fact given hints of the poem that she is going to take up in detail, and she has already spread the net quite convincingly and quite concretely here, that it's the personal moment, it's the personal truths, it is the personal experience that are being injected into poetry, which is supposed to be general, and that in the 1930s, the trend was that one should talk, from a public platform and about the issues that involve everyone. And this person struck a different note, and he said, that no, I'll just talk about my impressions, my experiences, my opinions, my perceptions, and that these things have to be done in poetic terms, but then a kind of balance is to be struck between the individual and the social. So I think with these words, we come to the end of the first part of the discussion, and very soon we'll get back to discuss the poem, The Autumn Journal, that was mentioned by Professor Payal Nagpal in some detail in the first part. Thank you.